Hi, it's Ron Coleman, of course, and you're the Colemanators. No guest today. We're going to just hang out, you and I. I want to talk about something that's kind of personal and that I have spoken about on other people's shows. I don't think I can write a book about it, and I'd like to put it all in one place. A lot of people think of me as a very pro-Israel, can I say figure? It's a little bit pretentious, perhaps. But if you know who I am, right, and if you're familiar with my work on social media, you will think of me as a pro-Israel account, a pro-Israel spokesman. I'm not a spokesman, obviously. I don't represent anyone but myself. And that is actually a mistake, not because I'm against the state of Israel as such. It's because that's not my focus and not my interest. I'm not really a Zionist. That doesn't make me an anti-Zionist. It just means that the philosophical foundations of Zionism as a movement are not applicable to my world outlook, which is defined by the Torah. Let me explain what that means. It's going to take a little bit of background, a little bit of time, and if you're not interested in it, well, then that will not probably be the first time you weren't interested in a video or a podcast. But I think it'll be worth listening to if you want to understand some of the ambiguities of some American Jews and our relationship to the state of Israel. I'm going to sort of start at the beginning. No, not the very, very beginning. I'm Orthodox. I wasn't always Orthodox. My family was Orthodox until a little bit more than 100 years ago, as was the case of the vast majority of Eastern European Jews. My ancestors are from Eastern Europe, predominantly Poland, Ukraine maybe, predominantly Poland. And about 100 years ago, the hold of religion on many traditional communities loosened significantly, especially after World War I. This is a well-known thing. My family, especially my mother's family, which was really the one whose cultural milieu was most significant to me, because they lived here. My father didn't have much family. His mother died when he was very young. And he was a traditional, semi-affiliated Jewish person who grew up in the the Lower East Side, kissing mezuzahs and being respectful of religion, but without really knowing why. And without really knowing why he was observing or wasn't observing anything in particular. But that's just how it was in the 1930s in the Lower East Side. He did marry my mother, whose family had emigrated from Cuba to the United States in 1956. They got to Cuba from Poland, whence they emigrated in 1935. Why Cuba? Why Cuba? Because it wasn't Poland. My grandfather explained to me that you just couldn't live in Poland if you were Jewish. It was intolerable. And unfortunately, 3 million Jews who stayed behind, many of whom would have liked to leave Poland but couldn't afford to, or couldn't figure out how to, or couldn't get visas to other countries. And the vast majority of whom just never thought that extermination was in their future were eliminated, including hundreds of members of my grandparents' families. They all had lots of siblings. Very few of them survived. After the war, they joined my grandparents and my mother and her sisters in Cuba, and then they left Cuba on the cusp of the Castro takeover. My great-grandfather had been an observant Jew, and there are pictures of his visage, as a very traditional-looking Orthodox Jew from when he came from Poland. I'm pretty sure it's a passport picture. And then there are pictures of him as an assimilated New World Cuban Jewish gentleman. So that was his transformation, a very common one. My grandparents, his son, my grandfather himself, and my grandmother, they had been swept up in the post-World War I disconnection from traditional Jewish life. They joined the Jewish Labor Bund, B-U-N-D. It means council or circle. Organization. They were democratic labor, but kind of soft socialists. They were not socialists as such. They were Bundists. And part of the Jewish Labor Bund, in fact, was an identification with being Jewish, being part of the Jewish nation, the Jewish people, that was central to their conceptual existence. And because they were not internationalists, but instead were nationalists in this respect, in part, and for other reasons as well, probably, including just the usual politics and perhaps some anti-Semitism, I don't know, the Jewish Labor Bund was thrown out of the Socialist International by Lenin. But notably, the Jewish Labor Bundists were not Zionists. Zionists are nationalists, and socialists are internationalists. They just insisted on maintaining and preserving a Jewish national identity, a cultural identity, an ethical identity, because they were Jewish and they grew up Jewish. And this is not true of all Jews, of course. There were many Jewish communists and socialists who had no interest in maintaining their Jewish identity and became very wicked people. They had no connection whatsoever to any ethical base or foundation. For these reasons, we weren't one of those Israel families. We didn't talk a lot about Israel. Visiting Israel wasn't something our family did. I mean, we never went. As a child, I never went. My parents never went. My grandparents never went. Not because they were so ideological. They really weren't. They just wasn't part of their world outlook. This is not to say that we weren't interested in what was going on in Israel, though. We were, because this was, remember, I grew up in the 60s. So I really become coherent. I become of age. I become old enough to understand the world sometime after the 1967 war. And we knew that Israel was a country of Jewish people. And again, we were not all that ideological. It was just the group, the Jewish Labor Bund, and its watered down American equivalent, the Workmen's Circle in America. We're really, to a large extent, like the old equivalents of the old Landsmannschaften, the brotherhoods, what's the word I'm looking for? Fraternal organizations that were established by people who came from the same towns, mutual aid societies. I did go to Yiddish school. The Workmen's Circle established Yiddish schools. Instead of going to a Hebrew school, you'd go to Yiddish school after school in the afternoon, and I learned some Yiddish. In the Yiddish school, there was a big map of the state of Israel. And I think that's probably when I first really started to think about it, become aware of it. Now, the founders of the Workmen's Circle probably would not have been that pleased with the fact that there was a map of the state of Israel, because, again, it was not philosophically consistent for there to be one, but this was a matter of significant Jewish pride, and you have to keep in mind that, to a large extent, the Zionist movement was a reaction to centuries of Jewish disempowerment, to put it mildly. So the idea among old-timers, other than those whose outlooks were not formed by Zionism, obviously, other than those whose outlooks were not formed by religious doctrine on the topic of Zionism, tended to just generally see it as an exciting thing. Jews fighting back, Jews having independence. One morning, we went to my grandparents' house. Well, we didn't have a house. We lived in an apartment in Brooklyn, in Brighton Beach in Brooklyn, on East 12th Street. And my grandparents lived in Brooklyn also, a few blocks away. When I was very young, they lived in Flatbush on Ditmas Avenue. Oh no, was it Caton? It was Caton Avenue. But they left Flatbush, which had changed, and it really did change. Today you'll hear Orthodox Jewish people talking about Flatbush. They're not hardly at all in Flatbush. They're mostly in Midwood. I always say that unlike all the other Jewish neighborhoods that the Jews abandoned in New York when they changed, Flatbush held the distinction of being one where the Jews took the name with them when they moved. In any event, my grandparents lived a few blocks away, right on the beach in what was considered to be a high-end, nicer apartment building on the 16th floor of Seacoast Terrace. And for some reason, we were at my grandparents' house on Yom Kippur. I don't know why, really. But we were there, and I woke up in the morning, and my father, again, who was not observant, was listening to the radio. And his face was white. Remember, this is 1973. So I'm 10. Meaning that we had already moved, 1973, we had already moved to New Jersey. So we were visiting with my grandparents in Brooklyn, okay? Just figuring that out now. His face was white. It was Yom Kippur morning, and the Egyptians and the Syrians had attacked Israel. And it looked really bad. And he was scared. And this had a great effect on me. I had never really seen my father like this or this interested in what was going on in Israel. Why was he scared? Well, you probably know that the Israelis were caught off guard in the Yom Kippur War. They had failed to plan. They had taken their enemies lightly. They had been fooled by a number of public positions and actions taken by the Arabs. And it was touch and go for the first few days. Why did my father care? He wasn't a Zionist. We never went to Israel, but he didn't speak Hebrew. We were Jewish, and the people in Israel were Jewish. They were our extended family. We didn't know of any family members who had settled in Israel, although as the world got smaller in later years, we came to understand that indeed many of the people who had survived the devastation of Poland during World War II had ended up in Israel. No one we were close to, obviously, or we would have known about it, but extended family. But we didn't know anyone in Israel. We had no ideological connection to the concept of Israel. Yes, we had this sort of pride in independence, in something that traditionally Jews had not had. Let me take a step back before I complete this thought. As an assimilated Jew in Brooklyn, and then at this point living for a year in central New Jersey with a bunch of other lower middle class people who had moved from Brooklyn to East Windsor, New Jersey, to New Jersey's first planned unit development, Twin Rivers. We didn't go around thinking we were Jewish, thinking about being Jewish. We thought of ourselves as Americans. We were Jewish, of course we were, but none of us kept kosher. No one lit Sabbath lamps. No one observed. Some people observed the holidays. We were members of a conservative synagogue, which, if you don't know, was meant to, conservative movement was, I know the vast majority of you do know, but I'm often surprised how little people know. It was meant to bridge the gap between reform, which was not merely a watered down version of Judaism, it was really an anti-Jewish version of Judaism. The idea of conservative was, let's find ways to ease the burden of being religiously observant, but keep the structure of traditional Jewish practice so that you wore a yarmulke in synagogue, but the synagogue had mixed seating, men and women together. The liturgy was the same as the Orthodox liturgy. The main difference being, by the time I was growing up, that almost the only people who knew it and could lead services in the conservative synagogues were people who had almost all grown up in Orthodox synagogues. My point, though, is that we were regular Americans. We spoke English at home. Yes, my grandparents and the older people in our family spoke Yiddish at home, or they spoke Spanish, or combinations of both. But we did not think of ourselves as different. Now, that did change a little bit when we moved from Brooklyn to New Jersey, and we met up with a bunch of rednecks who noticed that a whole bunch of Jews had moved into the neighborhood and said things to us. But I'm talking about name calling, the bagels, your bagels. I mean, that was really the extent of it. It was really a sort of very casual, childish, you're different from us. I didn't think I was different from them, and I really wasn't. In any meaningful way, Israel wasn't an issue. So now I'm facing my father and his pallid face. because it looked very bad for Israel those first few days of the Yom Kippur War. I learned from my father that we Jewish people are connected to each other, not because of what we think of anyone else, not because of any sense of special mission, not at that visceral level that my father was feeling and conveying to me, but because we were an extended family. And it was very clear at that moment that if the Arabs overran Israel, they would kill everyone. They would kill everyone. It's 1973. The Holocaust was only 30 years ago. They would kill us all. Us. We considered these people to be our extended family. And this sense of loss, of tragic sectoral, massive, brutal loss had always been an echo in our family, because my grandparents had lost everyone, and everyone they knew had lost everyone. And it seemed as if we were going to experience this, God forbid, again. Well, by the grace of God, it didn't go that way. And the Israelis won that war. But it made quite an impression on me. And as the years went on, I became more interested in politics and more knowledgeable. I had more of an understanding of the state of Israel, how it got there, how it was viewed by religion, the Jewish faith, traditional Jewish faith, the less traditional Jewish faith. All very complicated. Orthodox Jews have a range of opinions about the state of Israel. There are people don't necessarily appreciate this fact. The Reform movement disowned any connection with the state of Israel. Its attitude was not the state. There was no state. Remember, this is essentially a movement that sprung up in Germany at the end of the 18th century. And their approach was, we are Germans of Jewish extraction. We're proud of our heritage, but we are loyal Germans. We do not have loyalty to any other state or prospective state. And there was no state or any prospect of any state. The whole enterprise of reform was, in fact, to accommodate modernity, instead of hoping for restoration of the Jewish Commonwealth or the traditional Jewish ways of life. Let's be citizens of the states where we live, whose lives are informed by some sort of Jewish ethos. Well, all the way on the opposite of that was the very traditional, mostly Eastern European approach, although it was shared by many rabbinical figures in Germany, which was, again, where the Reform movement began. And there were leaders among the German rabbinate who agreed with this Eastern European approach, and others who took a more liberal stance. And this is true in Eastern Europe as well. When I say liberal, I mean more openness toward some religiously rationalizable, rationalable, some religiously consistent Zionistic worldview. In any event, today, these issues are largely moot. It is true that there is a very small category of people who are committed to militantly opposing Zionism, and I mean Orthodox Jews, militantly opposing Zionism on their understanding of theological grounds. So much so that they are prepared to publicly provide aid and comfort to those who would literally wish them to die. And us. These people are mentally deranged. But in my community, there is considerable skepticism with respect to the Zionist enterprise, to its philosophical foundations, to the nature of Israeli society, to the intentions and fruits of what the Zionists meant to create and what they did create. But the Jews are in Israel. The Jews are in Israel. There isn't anywhere else they're going to go. There isn't anywhere else they could go, and there's no reason they should go. It is immoral to suggest that they should go because they will be forced out by terrorists or even by people who you want to maintain were, I don't want to say improperly, I don't want to say unlawfully, no matter what your position is, whether it is improper, whether it is unlawful, the State of Israel has existed since 1948. It has conquered territory. No other country in the world is expected to leave territory. This is really important. We know that people in the West especially, but really throughout the world, who are obsessed with the State of Israel and its misdeeds, supposed or real, and with the cause of the Palestinians, but who absolutely don't care about far, far greater tragedies on far, far greater scales inflicted by one group of people, one state, on other groups of people. Don't care. That they don't care about the Palestinians, and that they do care about the Jews. They obsessively care about the Jews, and not in a good way. That's why we say that much of what passes for anti-Zionism is in fact anti-Semitism. We see what animates you, we see what motivates you, and we see what doesn't. I'm not talking about anti-Semitism in this podcast. I'm talking about why people like me, who are not Zionists, who do not intend ever to live in Israel, who are not frequent visitors to Israel, who did not grow up with Israel as an idol or even really as much of a thing. I was far more interested in the Yankees in the mid-'70s than I was in Israel. Why we care so much? Because the world seems to have come to terms with the idea that it is once again okay, for whatever the hell reason they think, that it is okay to kill members of my family. And as I told you in the beginning of this podcast, I view them as my family. I viscerally feel that they're my family. I'm not interested in whether or not you think I have a right to feel that way. They are. That's how I feel. That's how my family feels. That's how we feel about each other. Doesn't mean that I even like them. They're my family. When we say never again, we are making two mistakes. One is that it is ever again now, precisely because of this attitude of the world, that it is okay to slaughter Jews as some sort of a revolutionary international movement, anti-colonial or whatever they want to call it. We're at ever again. The technical details as to whether genocidal intent and genocidal processes and mechanisms are in place are really mere details. It's ever again. So we can't say never again. We're there. Part of the reason we're there is because of the obsession among many Jews in Israel and in America on leveraging their identity as Jews on victimhood. This was a grave mistake. And it's a mistake that we're still making. And this idea that more Holocaust education, that's what we need. Go visit the death camps. We're talking about changing the views of people who have no souls, no hearts. They don't need Holocaust education. They need humanity. And Jews need to establish an identity, ideally as servants of God, that is not premised in any way on victimization. And the second reason, and here I will end, why we don't say never again, why never again is baloney, is because God decides the future of nations, of people, of kings. We can and must protect ourselves. We're obligated to do so. But we cannot demand the Messiah now. We cannot demand the temple now. And we cannot demand never again. That's in God's hands. That's how a Jewish person, in this podcast's opinion, is supposed to view things. And it's not an opinion I deduced myself. It's what my teachers have taught me, and it's what the Torah teaches. Anyway, now you understand Ron Coleman and his relationship with the state of Israel, with the people of Israel, with the family of Israel. I'm sure we're not done with this topic, but thank you very much for listening.